The words my sister Brenda spoke that Thanksgiving evening cut through the warm air of our family estate like a blade through silk. 23 family members sat around our grandmother's antique mahogany table, their faces glowing in the candlelight. As she raised her wine glass and proclaimed how some people sacrifice everything for family while others only think about themselves. Her eyes found mine across the table, holding my gaze with a mixture of righteousness and something darker that I couldn't quite identify. What none of them knew, what I had discovered just hours before in our dying grandmother's bedside drawer, was that the will they all expected to divide equally among us had named me as the sole inheritor of a fortune worth over $12 million. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sofia Castillo, and until that Thanksgiving dinner, I believed my family loved me unconditionally. I was 31 years old, a successful pediatric surgeon at Boston Children's Hospital, and the first person in my family to earn both an MD and complete a fellowship at Harvard Medical School. Growing up in our sprawling family compound in Beacon Hill, I was always the quiet one, the studious daughter who preferred books to parties, medical journals to gossip magazines. Our family had built their wealth through 3 generations of successful real estate development across New England. My great-grandfather, Miguel Castillo, had immigrated from Spain in 1952 with nothing but determination and a work ethic that would become legendary in our family stories. He started by buying rundown properties in Boston's emerging neighborhoods, renovating them with his own hands, and selling them to young families looking for their first homes. By the time my grandfather Eduardo took over the business in the 1980s, Castillo Properties had become one of the most respected development companies in Massachusetts. Eduardo expanded into commercial real estate, building shopping centers and office complexes that still bear the family name today. When my father Miguel Jr. inherited the company in 2005, he took it national, developing luxury resorts and high-end residential communities from Maine to Florida. But I had never wanted any part of the family business. While my cousins spent summers learning about property values and construction permits, I volunteered at free clinics and shadowed doctors at Mass General Hospital. While they studied business management and real estate law, I was memorizing anatomy textbooks and preparing for the MCAT. My grandmother Isabella, the family matriarch who had married into the Castillo dynasty and helped build it into an empire, understood my passion for medicine in ways that my parents never quite could. She would tell me stories about her own mother, who had been a nurse during the Spanish Civil War, treating wounded soldiers with whatever supplies she could find. Medicine is the highest calling, Grandmother Isabella would say during our weekly walks through the Boston Common. To heal people, to save lives, that is a gift that money cannot buy. Property and buildings, they can be torn down or sold. But a life you save, a child you heal, that impact lasts forever. She had supported my medical education financially and emotionally, attending my graduation from Harvard Medical School even though she was already showing early signs of the Alzheimer's disease that would eventually claim her sharp mind. When I matched for my pediatric surgery residency at Boston Children's Hospital, she threw a celebration dinner that rivaled some weddings. But the rest of my family viewed my career choice with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. They loved bragging about having a doctor in the family, especially one who had achieved such prestigious positions at such a young age. However, they never quite understood why I had chosen a path that would never generate the kind of wealth that real estate development could provide. My sister Brenda, 3 years older than me, had followed the traditional family path. She earned her MBA from Wharton, married Richard Pemberton from a prominent Connecticut family, and immediately joined Castillo Properties as vice president of development. She was charismatic and ambitious, with an instinct for profitable deals. That reminded everyone of our grandfather Eduardo. Brenda had always been the golden child, the daughter who would carry on the family legacy. She could walk into a room full of investors and command attention within minutes, explaining complex financial projections with the kind of confidence that made people want to hand her their checkbooks. She lived in a stunning Victorian mansion in Cambridge, drove luxury cars, and wore designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Our relationship had always been complicated by the unspoken competition between us. While I excelled academically and achieved recognition in the medical field, Brenda excelled socially and financially. She seemed to effortlessly navigate the world of high society charity events and exclusive country club gatherings, while I felt awkward and out of place at family business functions. The dynamic became more strained after our grandmother's Alzheimer's diagnosis 2 years earlier. As Isabella's condition deteriorated, Brenda naturally stepped into the role of primary caregiver coordinator, managing the team of nurses and specialists who provided round-the-clock care at the family estate. She handled the medical appointments, the financial arrangements, and the difficult decisions about treatment options. I offered to help, of course. My medical background could have been invaluable in understanding grandmother's condition and advocating for the best possible care. But Brenda insisted that she had everything under control, that my demanding surgical schedule would make it impossible for me to provide consistent support. "You save other people's children," she would say with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Let me take care of our family." I accepted this arrangement, partly because my surgical schedule was indeed demanding, and partly because I trusted Brenda to make good decisions for our grandmother's care. I visited Isabella every Sunday, spending hours reading to her, showing her photos from my medical missions to Guatemala, and hoping that somewhere in her fading mind, she still recognized the granddaughter who had followed her own path instead of the family business. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During these visits, I began to notice subtle changes in the household staff and the way they interacted with different family members. Rosa, our grandmother's personal care nurse, would sometimes look uncomfortable when certain relatives visited. James, the estate manager who had worked for our family for over 20 years, seemed increasingly stressed about financial matters related to the household expenses. But I attributed these observations to the natural strain that comes with managing the complex medical and emotional needs of an Alzheimer's patient. I was focused on my own demanding career, working 60-hour weeks in the pediatric surgery department, constantly studying to stay current with the latest medical advances, and trying to maintain some semblance of a personal life. My romantic relationships had always suffered because of my career dedication. I had dated other doctors who understood the demands of medical practice, but somehow we could never find enough time together to build something lasting. I had dated men outside the medical field, but they struggled to understand why I would choose to spend my Saturday nights reading surgical journals instead of attending social events. The irony was that while my family worried about my lack of romantic attachments, they also celebrated my professional achievements. When I was featured on the cover of Boston Medical Magazine for developing an innovative surgical technique for treating pediatric heart defects, the family proudly displayed copies in the reception area of Castillo Properties offices. When I was invited to speak at international medical conferences, they would mention it to their business associates and country club friends. But there was always an underlying assumption that eventually I would settle down, reduce my working hours, and maybe take a more active interest in the family business. This assumption became more explicit after Brenda married Richard and began producing the next generation of Castillo heirs. Their first son, Miguel Eduardo, was born 3 years ago and immediately became the center of family attention. Their daughter, Isabella Rose, born 18 months later, was named after our grandmother and treated like a precious princess by everyone in the extended family. Suddenly, family gatherings included discussions about legacy planning, about ensuring that the family business would continue to thrive for future generations, about the importance of maintaining family unity and shared values. These conversations always felt pointed, as if my childless, career-focused lifestyle was somehow a betrayal of family expectations. The pressure became more subtle but more persistent. Cousins would ask when I planned to start a family. Aunts would introduce me to their friends' eligible sons at family events. Uncle Carlos, who managed the family's investment portfolio, would joke about how my medical salary would never allow me to maintain the lifestyle I had grown up with, implying that I should consider other options for financial security. I tried to laugh off these comments, focusing on the satisfaction I found in my medical practice. Every successful surgery, every child whose life I helped save, felt like validation of my choices. When I removed a brain tumor from a 7-year-old girl named Emma, when I repaired a heart defect in a newborn baby whose parents had been told he might not survive, when I helped a teenage boy regain the use of his arm after a devastating car accident, I knew that I was exactly where I belonged. But the family pressure was affecting my confidence in ways I didn't fully recognize. I began to question whether I was being selfish by prioritizing my career over family expectations. I wondered if there was something wrong with me for not wanting the traditional path of marriage and motherhood that seemed to bring such joy to other women in my family. These doubts intensified as our grandmother's condition worsened. During my Sunday visits, Isabella would sometimes have moments of clarity where she would recognize me and want to talk about my work. She would ask about my patients, about the new surgical techniques I was learning, about my plans for the future. But she would also express concerns about my happiness, about whether I was building a life that would sustain me as I grew older. "Sophia, my dear," she said during one particularly lucid conversation 6 months ago, "I want you to know that I am proud of everything you have accomplished. But I also want you to promise me that you will not sacrifice your own happiness for anyone else's expectations." I thought about that conversation often in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. Our grandmother had been increasingly confused and agitated, requiring more intensive medical care. Brenda had hired additional nursing staff and was coordinating with a team of specialists to manage Isabella's declining condition. The whole family knew that we were probably approaching our last Thanksgiving with our beloved matriarch. There was an unspoken understanding that this gathering would be particularly significant, a time to express gratitude for Isabella's influence on our lives and to strengthen the family bonds that she had always considered sacred. As a result, the extended family had made special efforts to attend this year's dinner. Cousins flew in from California and Texas. Uncle Raphael drove up from New York with his wife and 3 children. Aunt Carmen brought her new husband, a man she had married just 6 months earlier after being widowed for 3 years. The family estate was filled with the sounds of children playing, adults catching up on each other's lives, and the comfortable chaos that comes with large family gatherings. The kitchen staff had been working for days to prepare our traditional Thanksgiving feast, complete with both American classics and Spanish dishes that honored our cultural heritage. I arrived at the estate early that Thursday morning, planning to spend some quiet time with grandmother Isabella before the festivities began. I found her in the sunroom, sitting in her favorite chair overlooking the garden where she had once grown prize-winning roses. She was more alert than she had been in weeks, her dark eyes clear and focused when I entered the room. "Sofia," she said, reaching for my hand with fingers that felt fragile but still strong. "I have been waiting for you. There is something important I need to tell you." I sat beside her, holding her hand gently and giving her my full attention. In her clearer moments, our grandmother often shared family stories or advice that felt precious and irreplaceable. "I have made some decisions about my will," she said, her voice carrying a firmness that reminded me of the strong woman she had been before the disease began stealing her memories. "Decisions that some people in the family will not understand, but decisions that I believe are right." She paused, looking out at the garden where autumn leaves were falling like golden confetti. "I have watched this family for many years, Sofia. I have seen how success and money can change people, how expectations and greed can poison relationships that should be based on love." I listened carefully, sensing that this conversation was more significant than our usual visits. There was an urgency in her manner that suggested she was fighting to communicate something important while her mind was still clear enough to do so. "You have chosen a different path," she continued. "You have built your life around helping others, around making a difference in the world that has nothing to do with money or status. You have never asked me for anything, never expected anything from the family wealth except the education that allowed you to pursue your dreams." I started to protest that I had been privileged to grow up in a family that could afford the best education, that I had benefited enormously from advantages that money could provide. But she squeezed my hand firmly, stopping my words. "Your sister and your cousins, they assume that the family money will be divided equally among all the grandchildren," Isabella said, her voice growing quieter but more intense. "They have made plans based on that assumption. They have borrowed money against their expected inheritance, made investment decisions, chosen lifestyles that depend on receiving a substantial sum from my estate." The implications of what she was telling me began to sink in, creating a cold feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with the chilly November morning. "But I have decided that the bulk of my estate will go to you, Sofia. Not because I love you more than the others, but because I trust you to use it wisely, to honor the values that have always been important to our family." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what she had just told me. The family estate was worth millions of dollars. The investment portfolio that Uncle Carlos managed contained stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings that had been accumulating value for decades. The idea that I would inherit the majority of this wealth was overwhelming and terrifying. "Grandmother, I don't want the money," I said finally. "I never expected it, and I don't need it. My medical practice provides everything I need for a comfortable life. Maybe you should reconsider this decision." Isabella smiled, the expression transforming her aged face into something that reminded me of the vibrant woman she had been throughout my childhood. "That is exactly why you are the right person to inherit it. You don't want it, you don't need it, but you will know how to use it for good." She explained that she had been working with her attorney to revise her will over the past several months, during periods when her mind was clear and she could make informed decisions about her estate. The new will established a substantial trust fund that would provide annual distributions to all of her grandchildren, ensuring that everyone would benefit from the family wealth. However, the majority of the estate, including the family home, the real estate investments, and the controlling interest in several business ventures, would go to me with the understanding that I would use these resources to continue the family's legacy of community involvement and charitable giving. "I have seen how you spend your free time," Isabella said. volunteering at free clinics, traveling to Guatemala to provide medical care for children who cannot afford surgery, donating your services to families who are struggling financially. You understand that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege. We talked for another hour about her vision for how the inheritance could be used to establish medical scholarships, fund research into pediatric diseases, and create programs that would provide healthcare access for underserved communities. Her ideas were thoughtful and specific, demonstrating that this decision was not impulsive but the result of careful consideration and planning. As our conversation concluded, Isabella made me promise not to discuss this information with other family members until after the will was officially read following her death. She wanted everyone to enjoy what might be our last Thanksgiving together, without the complications that this revelation would inevitably create. I left our conversation feeling conflicted and burdened by the secret knowledge I now carried. On one hand, I was deeply moved by my grandmother's trust in my judgment and her desire to use the family wealth for meaningful purposes. On the other hand, I was anxious about how the rest of the family would react when they learned about her decision. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of food preparation and family arrivals. I helped in the kitchen, played with my young cousins, and tried to participate in the cheerful chaos of family gathering preparations while keeping my grandmother's revelation locked away in my heart. By evening, 23 family members had gathered around the extended dining room table, with additional card tables set up to accommodate the children and teenagers. The room glowed with candlelight and was filled with the aromas of turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and all the traditional dishes that marked our family's Thanksgiving celebrations. As we took our seats, I found myself studying the faces around the table with new awareness. These were people I had loved my entire life, relatives who had celebrated my achievements and supported me through challenges. But I also began to notice things I had previously overlooked, subtle expressions and interactions that suggested undercurrents of competition and expectation that I had been naive to ignore. The stage was set for an evening that would change everything I thought I knew about my family and my place within it. The first signs of tension emerged during the appetizer course, subtle as shadows but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Uncle Carlos, who had always been the family's unofficial financial advisor, was discussing investment strategies with my cousin Miguel, speaking in the confident tones of someone who assumed certain financial outcomes were guaranteed. With the market performing so well this year, we should see substantial growth in the family portfolio, he said, cutting into his stuffed mushroom with practiced precision. Of course, when Isabella's estate is eventually distributed, we'll need to consider tax implications and investment diversification strategies for each beneficiary. My cousin Elena nodded enthusiastically, already mentally spending money that didn't yet belong to her. Richard and I have been looking at properties in Martha's Vineyard. Nothing too extravagant, just a summer home where the whole family could gather for vacations. It would be a wonderful investment and a way to keep the family connected across generations. The conversation continued around me like a financial planning session disguised as family dinner talk. Everyone seemed to have detailed plans for their expected inheritance, from vacation homes to business expansions to private school educations for children who were still in diapers. The assumptions were breathtaking in their certainty and scope. I watched my grandmother during these discussions, noting how she maintained her composure while listening to family members casually discuss dividing up her life's work. Her expression remained pleasantly neutral, but I could see a tightness around her eyes that suggested she was absorbing every word and filing it away for future consideration. Brenda dominated much of the dinner conversation, regaling everyone with stories about her latest real estate developments and her children's remarkable achievements. 3-year-old Miguel Eduardo was apparently already showing signs of mathematical brilliance, while 18-month-old Isabella Rose was developing an impressive vocabulary that suggested future academic success. She said, "Dividend, yesterday," Brenda announced proudly, causing ripples of laughter around the table. I was reviewing some financial documents while she was playing nearby, and she repeated the word perfectly. Richard thinks we should start her financial education early, maybe set up a small investment account that she can watch grow as she gets older. The conversation then shifted to my own life, as it inevitably did during family gatherings. Aunt Carmen, emboldened by wine and the festive atmosphere, decided to address what she clearly saw as my problematic single status. "Sofia, dear, you work so hard and accomplish such wonderful things," she began, her tone carrying the particular sweetness that usually preceded unwanted advice. "But don't you think it's time to consider settling down? You're 31 now. And if you want children, you really shouldn't wait much longer." I had heard variations of this conversation countless times, but tonight it felt different. Armed with the knowledge of my grandmother's will, I found myself analyzing these comments with new awareness. Was this genuine concern for my happiness? Or was there an underlying agenda related to family planning and inheritance expectations? My medical practice keeps me very fulfilled, I replied diplomatically, the same response I had been giving for years. I'm focused on developing new surgical techniques that could help thousands of children worldwide. That feels like meaningful work right now. Uncle Raphael, who had been mostly quiet during dinner, suddenly leaned forward with interest. But surely you don't plan to work such demanding hours forever? Even the most dedicated doctors eventually want to slow down, enjoy life, maybe start families of their own. The pressure in these conversations had always existed, but tonight I could feel something more calculated behind the concern. These weren't just relatives worried about my personal happiness. These were people who had financial plans that depended on family structures remaining predictable and inheritance distributions following expected patterns. Cousin Miguel joined the discussion with what he probably thought was helpful insight. You know, Sofia, with your medical expertise, you could be incredibly valuable to the family business. We've been considering expanding into medical real estate, building specialized facilities for healthcare providers. Your knowledge of what doctors need in terms of space and equipment could give us a huge competitive advantage. The suggestion was presented as an opportunity, but I recognized it as something else entirely. They were trying to find ways to integrate me more deeply into the family business structure, to make me more dependent on family resources and more committed to family financial interests. That's an interesting idea, I said carefully, but my passion really lies in direct patient care rather than business development. I can't imagine anything more rewarding than the work I'm already doing. My response seemed to frustrate several family members, though they tried to hide their disappointment behind supportive smiles. I was beginning to understand that my independence, which I had always seen as a strength, was viewed by some relatives as a problem that needed solving. The conversation took an even more pointed turn when Brenda began discussing her role in caring for our grandmother. She had clearly prepared remarks for this topic, speaking with the authority of someone who had appointed herself the family's primary caregiver and decision-maker. It's been challenging to coordinate Isabella's care while managing my responsibilities at Castillo Properties, she said, her voice carrying a note of noble sacrifice. But family comes first, always. I've had to turn down several major development opportunities because I couldn't travel as much as those projects would have required. She paused to ensure that everyone was paying attention, then continued with increasing emotional intensity. Richard and I have also had to postpone some of our own plans because so much of our time and energy has been focused on making sure Isabella receives the best possible care. It's what family does for each other. The speech felt rehearsed, designed to establish Brenda's credentials as the devoted granddaughter who had sacrificed personal and professional opportunities for family duty. But as I listened, I couldn't help thinking about all the times I had offered to help with grandmother's care, only to be told that my medical schedule made me unreliable. Of course, we all contribute in different ways, Brenda continued, her gaze settling on me with what appeared to be gracious inclusion but felt more like pointed criticism. Some people contribute financially, some people contribute time and energy, and some people contribute by pursuing careers that bring honor to the family name. The categorization was clear and deliberate. In Brenda's framework, she was contributing time and energy through direct caregiving, while I was contributing only indirectly through professional achievements that reflected well on the family reputation. The implication was that her contributions were more substantial and more valuable than mine. I felt a surge of anger that I struggled to contain. My medical career wasn't just about bringing honor to the family name. It was about saving children's lives, advancing medical knowledge, and using my skills to help people who desperately needed specialized care. But pointing this out would sound defensive and would escalate tensions that were already simmering below the surface. Instead, I focused on my grandmother, who was listening to this conversation with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was she noticing the same undercurrents that I was beginning to perceive? Did she understand that this dinner was becoming a performance designed to establish who deserved credit for family loyalty and sacrifice? The tension increased when Uncle Carlos raised his wine glass and suggested that we go around the table sharing what we were most grateful for this year. It seemed like a harmless Thanksgiving tradition, but given the evening's dynamics, it felt more like an opportunity for family members to make public statements about their dedication and contributions. Cousin Elena spoke about being grateful for family financial security that allowed her children to attend excellent schools. Uncle Raphael expressed gratitude for the family business success that had enabled him to purchase a new home. Aunt Carmen thanked the family for welcoming her new husband into their circle of prosperity and support. When the turn came to my young cousins, their responses were particularly revealing. 8-year-old Carlos Jr. said he was grateful that his family was rich enough to buy him anything he wanted. 6-year-old Patricia announced that she was thankful her grandmother was going to leave everyone lots of money when she died. The adults laughed nervously at these innocent revelations, but I found them deeply disturbing. These children were being raised with the assumption that wealth was guaranteed, that family money would always be available to solve problems and provide opportunities. What would happen to their sense of security and identity if those assumptions proved incorrect? My own turn to speak arrived with everyone's attention focused expectantly on me. I could feel the weight of their curiosity about what the family's black sheep would choose to emphasize on this significant evening. I'm grateful for the opportunity to use my medical training to help children who might not otherwise have access to specialized surgical care, I said, keeping my voice steady and sincere. This year I was able to perform life-saving operations on 12 children whose families couldn't afford private medical care. Their recoveries remind me every day that we have an obligation to use our advantages to help people who are less fortunate. The response around the table was politely appreciative, but I could sense that my gratitude statement was viewed as somewhat preachy and irrelevant to family concerns. I wasn't expressing gratitude for family support or family opportunities. Instead, I was talking about obligations to strangers and responsibilities that extended beyond family boundaries. Brenda's turn came last, and she had clearly saved her most powerful remarks for this moment. She stood up from her chair, wine glass in hand, and began what would become the speech that changed everything. I want to talk about sacrifice, she began, her voice carrying across the dining room with practiced authority. Not the kind of sacrifice that gets recognized in medical journals or brings prestigious awards, but the quiet, daily sacrifice that holds families together across generations. She paused to make eye contact with various family members, building dramatic tension like a skilled public speaker. Some people in this world chase individual achievement and personal recognition. They build careers that take them away from family responsibilities, that require them to prioritize strangers over the people who love them most. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as I realized that this speech was directed specifically at me, delivered in front of the entire extended family as a public rebuke of my life choices. But true sacrifice, Brenda continued, means putting family first even when it's inconvenient, even when it means giving up opportunities that might bring personal glory. It means being present for the people who need you, not just when it's dramatic or newsworthy, but every single day. Her voice grew more passionate as she warmed to her theme. It means managing an elderly grandmother's complex medical needs while juggling your own career responsibilities. It means coordinating with doctors and nurses and insurance companies and family members, making sure that someone who gave everything to build this family's success receives the care and attention she deserves in her final years. The emotional manipulation was masterful. Brenda was positioning herself as the family's moral center, the person who understood what really mattered while others chased selfish pursuits. She was also establishing a direct connection between caregiving sacrifice and worthiness to inherit family resources. It means making financial sacrifices too, she continued, her voice taking on a tone of noble suffering. Turning down profitable business opportunities because family comes first. Spending your own money on medical expenses and household improvements because you want your grandmother to be comfortable, not because anyone will ever know or appreciate the cost. I felt trapped between the desire to defend myself and the knowledge that arguing would only make me look petty and self-centered. Brenda had crafted her speech carefully, making it almost impossible to respond without appearing defensive or ungrateful for family support. Some people measure success by individual achievements, she said, building toward her conclusion. But I measure success by family loyalty, by being present when people need you most, by sacrificing your own desires for the good of the people you love. She raised her wine glass higher, preparing for a toast that would seal her message in everyone's memory. So tonight, I want to toast real sacrifice. The kind that doesn't get public recognition but makes everything else possible. The kind that holds families together and honors the people who came before us. The entire table raised their glasses in response to her toast, caught up in the emotional power of her words and the wine-enhanced sentiment of the moment. But as I mechanically lifted my own glass, I felt something cold and calculating in the air that had nothing to do with gratitude or family love. This wasn't just a speech about sacrifice. It was a strategic performance designed to establish Brenda's claim to family leadership and family resources. She was making a public case for why her contributions to the family were more valuable than anyone else's, particularly more valuable than mine. The timing was perfect and probably not accidental. With our grandmother's health declining, this was exactly the moment when family members would begin positioning themselves for inheritance discussions and leadership transitions. Brenda's speech was a masterful opening move in what I was beginning to recognize as a calculated campaign. As we returned to our dinner, the conversation continued around topics related to family loyalty and sacrifice, with various relatives sharing stories about times they had put family obligations ahead of personal desires. Each anecdote seemed designed to reinforce the themes that Brenda had established, creating a chorus of voices that supported her moral framework. But I found myself thinking about different kinds of sacrifice that weren't being acknowledged or celebrated. What about the sacrifice of spending 4 years in medical school while my peers were starting their careers and earning money? What about the sacrifice of completing a grueling surgical residency that required working 100-hour weeks for years? What about the sacrifice of using my vacation time to perform free surgeries in Guatemala instead of taking relaxing trips to Europe? These sacrifices had been made not for personal glory, as Brenda suggested, but for the purpose of developing skills that could help people who desperately needed medical care. Every hour I spent studying surgical techniques was an hour invested in becoming better able to save children's lives. Every sleepless night during residency was preparation for emergency situations where my expertise could mean the difference between life and death for a young patient. But these sacrifices didn't fit the narrative that Brenda was constructing. In her framework, sacrifice only counted if it directly benefited family members and family interests. Sacrifice for humanitarian purposes, sacrifice for medical advancement, sacrifice for helping people outside the family circle was apparently selfish rather than noble. As the evening progressed, I became increasingly aware of how isolated my perspective had become within the family structure. My values, my priorities, my definition of meaningful work, all of these seemed to be diverging from family expectations in ways that I hadn't fully recognized before. The conversation eventually turned to future plans and family goals for the coming year. Uncle Carlos announced that he was considering expanding the family's investment portfolio into international markets. Cousin Miguel discussed his plans to open a new Castillo Properties office in Florida. Aunt Carmen talked about hosting a family reunion cruise that would allow everyone to vacation together while strengthening family bonds. Through all of these discussions, I noticed a consistent assumption that family money would be available to fund these various projects and adventures. There was no discussion of what would happen if inheritance distributions were different than expected, no consideration of alternative scenarios where family financial resources might be allocated according to different priorities. When the evening finally concluded with coffee and dessert, I felt emotionally exhausted from the strain of maintaining polite composure while processing the various undercurrents and implications of the conversations I had witnessed. As family members began saying their goodbyes and making plans for future gatherings, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family dynamics was more complicated than I had ever imagined. The secret knowledge of my grandmother's will felt like a heavy burden that was growing heavier with each passing hour. How would these people react when they learned that their assumptions about inheritance were completely wrong? How would Brenda respond when she discovered that her speech about sacrifice hadn't secured the family leadership role she was clearly preparing to claim? As I drove home to my quiet apartment that night, I found myself questioning everything I thought I understood about family loyalty, personal sacrifice, and the true meaning of success. The woman who had entered that Thanksgiving dinner feeling secure in her choices and confident in her family relationships was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to see the darker motivations that had always existed beneath the surface of family gatherings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the family began processing the emotional dynamics of this evening, but tonight I needed time to think about what I had learned and what it meant for my future relationship with the people I had always considered my closest support system. The phone call came at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving. I was already at the hospital, reviewing surgical notes before my first operation of the day, when Rosa's trembling voice delivered the news that I had been dreading but expecting. "Dr. Sofia, you need to come quickly. Miss Isabella," she passed peacefully in her sleep last night. The drive to the family estate felt surreal, as if I were moving through a dream where familiar landmarks had taken on strange new meanings. The tree-lined streets of Beacon Hill, the elegant brownstones with their perfect gardens, the wrought iron gates that marked the entrance to our family compound, all of these looked exactly the same but felt completely different knowing that my grandmother was no longer there to give them life and meaning. I arrived to find the estate already buzzing with activity. Brenda had clearly taken charge of the situation, coordinating with funeral directors, notifying extended family members, and managing the complex logistics that follow the death of a family matriarch. She moved through the house with purposeful efficiency, her grief expressed through action rather than tears. "Sofia, thank God you're here," she said, embracing me with genuine emotion that temporarily dissolved the tensions from our Thanksgiving dinner. "I've been trying to handle everything. But there are so many decisions to make, so many people to contact." For the next 3 days, we worked together to plan a funeral that would honor our grandmother's legacy while accommodating the needs and expectations of a large extended family. Despite our recent conflicts, Brenda and I fell back into the collaborative relationship we had shared as children, dividing responsibilities and supporting each other through the emotional exhaustion of grief and logistics. I found myself genuinely appreciating Brenda's organizational skills and her ability to manage complex family dynamics during a crisis. She handled difficult relatives with diplomacy, coordinated with clergy and funeral directors with authority, and ensured that every detail of the service reflected our grandmother's values and preferences. The funeral itself was beautiful and dignified, held at St. Mary's Cathedral where our grandmother had been a devoted parishioner for over 40 years. The church was filled with family members, business associates, community leaders, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Isabella's generosity and wisdom. During the service, I delivered a eulogy that focused on my grandmother's belief in using privilege for public good, her support for education and healthcare initiatives, and her quiet but consistent charity work that had helped countless families throughout Boston. I spoke about her encouragement of my medical career and her understanding that true success meant making a positive difference in other people's lives. Brenda's eulogy emphasized different aspects of our grandmother's character, focusing on her role as the family's emotional center, her dedication to preserving family traditions, and her skill in building the kinds of relationships that strengthened both family bonds and business success. Both speeches were heartfelt and appropriate, but they reflected the different ways we had experienced and interpreted our grandmother's influence. The week following the funeral passed in a haze of condolence visits, thank you note writing, and the gradual process of returning to normal routines while adjusting to the reality of life without Isabella's presence. I threw myself back into my surgical schedule, finding comfort in the familiar demands of medical practice and the clear sense of purpose that came from helping young patients recover from complex procedures. But even as I tried to focus on my work, I found myself thinking constantly about the secret knowledge I carried regarding my grandmother's will. The attorney had scheduled a family meeting for the following Monday to read the will and discuss estate distribution, and I was dreading the moment when this information would become public knowledge. I spent hours imagining different scenarios for how the family might react to learning about the inheritance arrangement. Would they be angry? Hurt? Confused? Would they blame me for somehow manipulating our grandmother's decision, or would they understand that I had been as surprised as anyone to learn about her plans? The weekend before the will reading, I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of waiting for the family meeting, I drove to Brenda's house on Sunday evening to tell her privately about what I knew. I felt that she deserved to hear this information from me rather than learning about it in front of the entire extended family. Brenda answered the door wearing yoga clothes, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking more relaxed than I had seen her since before grandmother's death. Sophia, what a nice surprise. Come in, Richard just put the kids to bed and I was about to open a bottle of wine. We settled into her elegant living room, surrounded by family photos and expensive furniture that reflected the comfortable lifestyle she had built through her success in the family business. For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things, catching up on work schedules and discussing plans for the upcoming holidays. But eventually, I gathered my courage and began the conversation that I knew would change everything between us. Brenda, there's something I need to tell you about grandmother's will, I said, my voice sounding strangely formal in the intimate setting of her home. Something I learned a few hours before she died, something that's going to come as a shock to everyone tomorrow. She set down her wine glass and gave me her full attention, her expression shifting from casual friendliness to focused concern. What kind of shock? Is there a problem with the estate documentation? Did grandmother forget to update something important? I took a deep breath and delivered the news as gently as I could. She changed her will several months ago. Instead of dividing everything equally among the grandchildren, she left the majority of the estate to me. There are trust funds for everyone else, but the bulk of the inheritance, including the house and the business investments, those are coming to me. The silence that followed my announcement was deafening. Brenda stared at me with an expression that cycled through disbelief, confusion, and something that looked like betrayal. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. That's impossible. Grandmother would never do something like that without discussing it with the family. She wouldn't just arbitrarily choose one person over everyone else, especially not when I've been the one taking care of her for the past 2 years. I explained what our grandmother had told me about her reasoning, about her desire to see the family wealth used for charitable purposes and community benefit rather than personal luxury. I tried to convey Isabella's belief that I would be the most responsible steward of resources that represented generations of family work and sacrifice. But as I spoke, I could see that my explanations were only making things worse. From Brenda's perspective, this decision represented not just a financial loss but a repudiation of everything she had done to care for our grandmother and position herself as the family's natural leader. "So you knew about this at Thanksgiving?" she said, her voice taking on an edge that I had never heard before. "You sat there listening to me talk about sacrifice and family loyalty, knowing that grandmother had already decided you were more deserving than the rest of us." The accusation stung because it contained an element of truth. I had known about the will when I listened to her speech, and I hadn't found a way to respond to her implications about my selfishness and lack of family commitment. But I had also been honoring our grandmother's request not to discuss the inheritance until after her death. "I couldn't say anything because grandmother asked me not to," I replied, recognizing how weak this sounded even as I said it. "She wanted the family to have time together without this complicating our relationships. She was trying to protect everyone from having to deal with this information while she was still alive." Brenda stood up abruptly and began pacing around the room, her movements sharp and agitated. "Protect everyone? Sofia, this is going to destroy our family. Do you have any idea how many people have made financial plans based on expecting their share of grandmother's estate? Elena and David put a down payment on that Martha's Vineyard house. Carlos borrowed money against his expected inheritance to expand his business. Uncle Raphael committed to funding his daughter's graduate school education." As she listed the various financial commitments that family members had made, I began to understand the full scope of the crisis that tomorrow's will reading would create. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or wounded pride. There would be real financial consequences for people who had assumed that family wealth would be available to support their lifestyle choices and investment decisions. "And what about me?" Brenda continued, her voice rising with emotion. "I turned down a partnership opportunity in Chicago because I thought I needed to stay in Boston to manage grandmother's care and prepare to take over more family business responsibilities. I've been planning my entire future around the assumption that I would inherit enough money to give my children the same advantages we grew up with. I had never considered how my inheritance might affect Brenda's long-term plans or her children's future opportunities. In my mind, the trust funds that grandmother had established would provide substantial financial support for everyone in the family. But clearly, Brenda had been expecting much more than trust fund distributions. "The trust funds will still provide significant annual income," I said, trying to offer some reassurance. "And grandmother specifically wanted me to use the estate to fund charitable projects that would benefit the whole community, including programs that could help with education and healthcare costs for family members." But Brenda wasn't interested in hearing about charitable programs or community benefits. She was focused on the immediate reality that her expectations had been completely overturned and her financial planning had been based on incorrect assumptions. "You don't understand," she said, stopping her pacing to face me directly. "This isn't just about money. This is about respect and recognition and family hierarchy. Grandmother essentially declared that my years of sacrifice and caregiving were worth less than your medical career that takes you away from family responsibilities half the time." The conversation continued for another 2 hours, growing increasingly heated as we both struggled to process the implications of grandmother's decision and its impact on our relationship. Brenda alternated between anger at our grandmother for making such a dramatic choice without family consultation, and resentment toward me for being selected as the primary beneficiary. I tried to explain that I had never wanted this responsibility, that I would be happy to work with the family to find ways to distribute resources more equitably. But Brenda interpreted my reluctance as false modesty designed to make me appear more deserving of the inheritance. "If you really don't want the money," she said with bitter sarcasm, "then you could refuse the inheritance and let it be distributed according to what everyone expected. But I notice you're not offering to do that." She was right, and her challenge forced me to examine my own motivations and desires more honestly. While I genuinely hadn't sought this inheritance and felt overwhelmed by the responsibility it represented, I was also beginning to see possibilities for using these resources in ways that could make a meaningful difference in many people's lives. With $12 million, I could establish scholarship programs that would enable dozens of students from low-income families to attend medical school. I could fund research projects that might lead to breakthrough treatments for pediatric diseases. I could create healthcare programs that would provide free surgical care for children whose families couldn't afford private medical treatment. These possibilities excited me in ways that personal luxury never could. I had grown up with financial security and had never felt deprived of material comforts. But the opportunity to use family wealth for humanitarian purposes felt like a chance to honor both my grandmother's values and my own commitment to helping people through medical practice. By the time I left Brenda's house that evening, it was clear that our relationship had been fundamentally altered by this conversation. We had moved from being sisters who occasionally disagreed to being people with competing interests and incompatible perspectives on family responsibility and resource allocation. The family meeting the next morning took place in the conference room of grandfather's law firm, a mahogany-paneled space that had hosted important family business discussions for over 30 years. 21 family members gathered around the long table, their faces reflecting anticipation mixed with the solemnity appropriate for discussing a beloved matriarch's final wishes. Attorney Michael Harrison had been our family's legal counsel. For decades, a distinguished man in his 70s who had helped draft wills and trusts for 3 generations of Castillos. He began the meeting with condolences and brief remarks about Isabella's legacy before moving to the formal reading of her will. The first sections covered standard bequests to charitable organizations, household staff, and family friends. There were generous gifts to St. Mary's Cathedral, to the Boston Children's Hospital Foundation, and to several scholarship programs that grandmother had supported throughout her life. Then came the distributions to family members. Each grandchild would receive a substantial trust fund that would provide annual income for life, with additional provisions for education expenses, medical emergencies, and other specified needs. The amounts were generous enough to ensure financial security but not large enough to replace the need for personal career development or responsible financial planning. The room remained respectfully quiet during these announcements, with family members nodding approvingly at the fairness and thoughtfulness of grandmother's planning. But I could sense growing tension as Attorney Harrison approached the section that would address the disposition of the major estate assets. The remainder of Isabella Castillo's estate, he read in his formal courtroom voice, including the family residence, investment portfolio, and controlling interests in various business ventures, is bequeathed to Sofia Elena Castillo, with the understanding that these resources will be used to continue the family's tradition of community service and charitable giving. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and terrible. I watched as family members processed what they had just heard, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock to various forms of anger and disappointment. Uncle Carlos was the first to find his voice. "There must be some mistake," he said, his face flushed with emotion. "Isabella would never have made such an unbalanced distribution without consulting the family. This will must have been written during a period when her judgment was compromised by her illness." Attorney Harrison had clearly anticipated this reaction. He explained that the will had been drafted and executed during a period when medical evaluations confirmed that Isabella's mental capacity was unimpaired, and that multiple witnesses could attest to her clear understanding of the decisions she was making. Furthermore, he added, "Mrs. Castillo specifically instructed me to inform the family that this decision reflects her careful consideration of each person's character, values, and likely use of inherited resources. She was not suffering from diminished capacity, and she was not acting impulsively." The meeting dissolved into chaos as family members began talking over each other, demanding explanations, expressing outrage, and threatening legal challenges. Cousin Elena announced that she would contest the will based on undue influence. Uncle Raphael declared that grandmother's decision was evidence of manipulative behavior that should be investigated. Through it all, I sat quietly at the table, feeling like the eye of a hurricane that was destroying everything I had once believed about family loyalty and love. These people who had shared holiday dinners and birthday celebrations with me for my entire life were now viewing me as an enemy, who had somehow stolen what rightfully belonged to them. Brenda's reaction was the most devastating because it was the most controlled. While others shouted and accused, she simply stared at me with cold disappointment, as if I had personally betrayed not just her expectations but everything she thought she knew about my character. "I suppose your speech about gratitude and helping people was just preparation for this moment," she said when the room finally quieted enough for her voice to be heard. "Very touching performance, Sofia. I'm sure grandmother was impressed by your humanitarian rhetoric." The accusation that I had manipulated our grandmother's decision cut deeper than any of the financial concerns or inheritance disputes. This was an attack on my integrity and my motivations, suggesting that my medical career and charitable work were just elaborate deceptions designed to position me for financial gain. As the meeting ended with various family members storming out or huddling in angry consultation groups, I realized that my life had fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond financial resources. I was now wealthy beyond anything I had ever imagined, but I had also lost the family relationships that had always provided my emotional foundation. The choice ahead of me was clear but difficult. I could try to repair family relationships by redistributing the inheritance more equitably, essentially overruling our grandmother's carefully considered decision. Or I could honor her wishes and use these resources for the charitable purposes she had envisioned, accepting that this might permanently alienate me from people I had always loved. As I drove home from the lawyer's office, I thought about a conversation I had with grandmother just 6 months earlier, when she was still lucid enough to share her deepest thoughts about family and responsibility. Sofia, she had said, the hardest part of having wealth is learning that money reveals people's true character, including your own. The question is not whether you deserve to inherit family resources, but what you will do with them once you have them. Now I understood what she meant, and I knew that the real test of my character was just beginning. The legal challenges began within a week of the will reading. Uncle Carlos hired a team of estate attorneys who filed motions claiming that our grandmother had lacked the mental capacity to make such dramatic changes to her inheritance plans. Cousin Elena submitted psychological evaluations suggesting that Isabella's Alzheimer's diagnosis made any recent legal decisions questionable and potentially invalid. But I had an advantage that the family didn't expect. During one of my medical visits with grandmother, I had suggested that she undergo comprehensive cognitive testing to establish a baseline for her condition and help with future care planning. The neuropsychological evaluation, conducted just 2 months before her death, showed that while she was experiencing early-stage memory issues, her executive function and decision-making capabilities remained entirely intact. Dr. Patricia Walsh, the neurologist who had overseen grandmother's care, provided testimony that Isabella's cognitive abilities were sufficient for making complex legal and financial decisions. The brain scans and memory tests showed deterioration in areas related to short-term memory and spatial orientation, but the regions responsible for judgment, reasoning, and long-term planning were functioning normally. More importantly, Attorney Harrison produced detailed notes from multiple meetings with grandmother, documenting her clear articulation of her reasons for changing the will and her specific instructions about how she wanted the estate to be managed. These notes revealed a thoughtful, deliberate process that had taken place over several months, not an impulsive decision made during a moment of confusion. The legal battle consumed 3 months and cost the family tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, but ultimately the challenges were unsuccessful. The will stood as written, and I officially became the sole inheritor of the majority of our grandmother's estate. During this period, the family dynamics became increasingly toxic. Thanksgiving and Christmas gatherings were canceled because nobody could agree on where to hold them or how to manage the tension between family members. Cousins stopped calling each other. Aunts and uncles took sides in the dispute, creating factions that turned family relationships into strategic alliances. Brenda and I didn't speak for 2 months. When we finally had a conversation, it was through attorneys who were trying to negotiate a settlement that might satisfy everyone involved. But the discussions broke down when it became clear that no amount of additional money would repair the fundamental breach of trust and expectations that had occurred. The isolation was devastating in ways I hadn't anticipated. For my entire life, family gatherings had provided emotional support, social connection, and a sense of belonging that grounded my identity. Suddenly, I was wealthy beyond imagination, but completely cut off from the relationships that had always mattered most to me. I threw myself into my medical practice with renewed intensity, working longer hours and taking on more complex cases as a way to avoid thinking about the personal relationships that had collapsed around me. But even the satisfaction of successful surgeries couldn't completely fill the emotional void left by family estrangement. The turning point came 6 months after the will reading, when I received a letter from Dr. Maria Santos, the director of a children's hospital in Guatemala City. She had heard about my volunteer work in Central America and was writing to ask if I might consider funding an expansion of their pediatric surgery program. The hospital served one of the poorest regions in Guatemala, providing free medical care to families who had no other options for treating serious illnesses and injuries. They had identified 47 children who needed complex surgical procedures that couldn't be performed with their current equipment and facilities, but they lacked the resources to upgrade their operating rooms or hire additional specialized staff. Dr. Santos's letter included photos of some of these children, along with medical summaries that detailed their conditions and prognosis. 8-year-old Carlos needed surgery to repair a heart defect that would kill him within 2 years if left untreated. 5-year-old Isabella required a complex brain operation to remove a tumor that was causing seizures and developmental delays. 12-year-old Miguel had been born with a spinal condition that could be corrected surgically, allowing him to walk normally for the first time in his life. As I read through the medical files and looked at the photographs of these beautiful children, I felt something shift inside me. Here was a concrete opportunity to use my inheritance in exactly the way my grandmother had envisioned, to make a difference in the lives of people who desperately needed help and had nowhere else to turn. I contacted Dr. Santos immediately and arranged to visit Guatemala to assess the hospital's needs firsthand. What I found was a facility with dedicated, talented medical staff who were performing miracles with inadequate resources. They had doctors who could rival any surgeon in Boston, but they were operating in rooms with outdated equipment and insufficient supplies. The total cost to upgrade their facilities, purchase new surgical equipment, and fund the specialized training needed to perform complex pediatric procedures was less than $2 million. It was a fraction of my inheritance, but it would literally save dozens of lives and provide a foundation for helping thousands of children in the years to come. I made the decision to fund the entire project, working directly with Dr. Santos, to design a program that would not only upgrade the immediate facilities but establish sustainable funding for ongoing operations. We created a scholarship program for local medical students who wanted to specialize in pediatric surgery, ensuring that the hospital would continue to have qualified staff even after the initial expansion was complete. The project took 8 months to implement, during which I spent considerable time in Guatemala, working alongside the medical team and participating in surgeries whenever my skills could be useful. It was exhausting and challenging work, but it reminded me why I had chosen medicine as a career and what kind of impact was possible when resources were used for humanitarian purposes. The first surgery performed in the new operating suite was Carlos's heart repair, a delicate procedure that required 6 hours of meticulous work to correct the defect that had threatened his life. When he woke up in recovery with a strong, steady heartbeat, his mother wept with gratitude that transcended language barriers. Isabella's brain surgery was equally successful, removing the tumor that had been causing her seizures and allowing her to begin developing normally for the first time in her young life. Miguel's spinal correction required multiple procedures, but within 6 months he was walking without assistance, running and playing like any healthy 12-year-old. These successes created a ripple effect throughout the region, as word spread about the upgraded hospital and the specialized care now available for children with complex medical conditions. Families began traveling from neighboring countries, seeking treatment that had previously been impossible to access. But the most profound impact was on my own sense of purpose and identity. Working in Guatemala reminded me that medical practice was about more than personal achievement or professional recognition. It was about using specialized knowledge and skills to help people who were suffering, regardless of their ability to pay or their social status. The work also provided a new perspective on the family conflicts that had consumed so much of my emotional energy over the past year. While my relatives were arguing about inheritance distributions and fighting legal battles over money they had never earned, I was watching children recover from life-threatening conditions and return to normal, healthy lives. The contrast was stark and clarifying. My family's anger about the inheritance was based on expectations and assumptions about what they deserved, but it had nothing to do with actual need or genuine hardship. They were upset about not receiving money that would have funded luxury purchases and lifestyle upgrades, while the children in Guatemala had been facing death or permanent disability because they lacked access to basic medical care. When I returned to Boston after completing the Guatemala project, I found that my perspective on the family situation had fundamentally changed. I was no longer defensive about inheriting grandmother's estate, and I was no longer desperately hoping to repair relationships with people who viewed my humanitarian work as somehow selfish or misguided. Instead, I began planning additional projects that would expand on the success of the Guatemala hospital. I established the Sofia Castillo Foundation for Pediatric Medicine, creating an endowment that would fund similar hospital upgrades throughout Central and South America. I also created scholarship programs for medical students from low-income families, providing full funding for education in exchange for commitments to serve underserved communities. The foundation's work began attracting attention from other philanthropists and medical organizations, leading to partnerships that multiplied the impact of the initial investment. Within 2 years, we had funded hospital improvements in 7 countries, provided scholarships for 63 medical students, and directly helped more than 400 children receive surgical care that saved or dramatically improved their lives. These achievements brought recognition that I had never sought but found deeply satisfying. Medical journals published articles about the Foundation's innovative approach to international healthcare development. Universities invited me to speak about combining medical practice with philanthropic initiatives. International humanitarian organizations sought partnerships for expanding access to pediatric surgical care in developing countries. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. I received letters from parents whose children had been helped by Foundation-funded programs, sharing photos and updates about their recovery and expressing gratitude that changed my understanding of what success really meant. One letter that particularly moved me came from the mother of a little girl named Sofia, named after me following a successful surgery that had corrected a facial deformity. The child's mother wrote about how the operation had not only improved her daughter's health but had given her confidence to attend school and make friends for the first time in her life. Before the surgery, other children would stare at Sofia and sometimes say cruel things about how she looked, the mother wrote in carefully practiced English. Now she smiles all the time and talks about wanting to become a doctor so she can help other children the way you helped her. You gave my daughter not just a new face, but a new future. These letters reminded me daily that my grandmother's decision to entrust me with the family's wealth had created opportunities for impact that extended far beyond anything money could have provided for my relatives' personal comfort or social status. The success of the foundation work also began attracting attention from family members who had previously been hostile or dismissive about my inheritance. Cousin Elena, who had been one of the most vocal critics of grandmother's will, reached out after reading an article about our Guatemala project in a medical journal. I want you to know that I'm starting to understand what grandmother saw in you, she wrote in an email that surprised me with its humility and introspection. I was so focused on what I thought I deserved that I never considered what you might do with resources that the rest of us would have just spent on ourselves. Uncle Raphael made a similar acknowledgement after attending a foundation fundraising event where he heard directly from some of the doctors and families who had benefited from our programs. He approached me afterward with tears in his eyes, apologizing for the legal challenges and expressing pride in what I had accomplished. Isabella would be so proud of what you're doing, he said, using our grandmother's name for the first time since the will reading. I can see now why she trusted you with this responsibility. You're honoring her memory in ways that none of the rest of us would have thought to do. But the most significant reconciliation came from Brenda, who contacted me on the second anniversary of grandmother's death. She asked if we could meet for coffee, saying that she had some things she needed to say and some apologies she needed to make. We met at a small cafe near Boston Common, neutral territory that held no memories of family conflicts or inheritance disputes. Brenda looked different than I remembered, more relaxed and less driven, as if the past 2 years had taught her something important about priorities and happiness. I've been following the foundation's work, she began, stirring her coffee nervously. Reading the articles, watching the videos, learning about the children you've helped. And I realized that I owe you a huge apology, not just for the legal challenges, but for completely misunderstanding what you were about. She explained that losing the expected inheritance had forced her to reassess her values and priorities in ways that turned out to be beneficial for her personal growth. Without the security of family wealth, she had needed to build her own financial independence through professional achievement and careful planning. It was terrifying at first, she admitted. But it also forced me to prove to myself that I could succeed based on my own abilities, not just because I was born into a wealthy family. I'm actually stronger and more confident now than I was when I thought I could rely on inheritance money to solve any problems. She had used the crisis as motivation to expand her role at Castillo Properties, developing innovative housing projects that provided affordable homes for working families. Her success in this area had led to recognition as one of Boston's most effective affordable housing developers, bringing professional satisfaction that was more meaningful than anything she had achieved through traditional luxury real estate. I also realized that my speech about sacrifice at Thanksgiving was really about the wrong kind of sacrifice, she continued. I was talking about giving up opportunities for family obligations, but you were actually sacrificing personal comfort and convenience to help people who really needed it. Your kind of sacrifice creates something positive in the world, while mine was just about maintaining family expectations. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering not just apologies and reconciliation but also our different perspectives on family responsibility, personal fulfillment, and the meaning of legacy. We discovered that our values were actually more aligned than either of us had realized, but we expressed them through different choices and priorities. By the end of our meeting, we had begun planning ways that Brenda's expertise in real estate development could support the foundation's work. She proposed creating affordable housing projects near the hospitals we were funding, providing stable homes for medical staff and patients' families. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that could multiply the impact of our humanitarian programs. As I walked home from that coffee meeting, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that Thanksgiving dinner 2 years earlier. I had lost a family structure that I thought was essential to my happiness, but I had gained a sense of purpose and accomplishment that was more fulfilling than anything I had previously experienced. The broken relationships had healed into something stronger and more authentic than what had existed before. The family members who remained in my life were there because they chose to support my work and share my values, not because they felt obligated by blood relationships or financial expectations. Most importantly, I had learned that my grandmother's decision to entrust me with the family wealth was not just about my individual character or achievements. It was about her vision for how resources could be used to create positive change in the world, and her belief that I would have the courage to pursue that vision even when it meant disappointing people's expectations. Standing in the Boston Common where I had walked with grandmother so many times, I understood that her true legacy was not the money she had left me, but the example she had set for using privilege and resources to help others. The inheritance had given me the means to make a difference, but the inspiration and guidance had come from watching her live her values consistently throughout her life. The foundation continued to grow and expand its impact, but I knew that the real success was measured not in dollars distributed or programs funded, but in the lives changed and the hope restored for families who had thought their children's medical conditions were beyond help. Every surgery we funded, every scholarship we provided, every hospital we upgraded, represented a choice to use wealth for its highest purpose, creating opportunities for people to live healthy, productive lives regardless of their economic circumstances. That was the lesson my grandmother had tried to teach our entire family, and the responsibility she had trusted me to carry forward. It was a legacy worth more than any amount of money, and one that would continue long after the last dollar of inheritance had been spent on programs that mattered. As the sun set over the Boston skyline, I felt grateful not just for the resources I had inherited, but for the wisdom to use them well and the courage to disappoint people's expectations in service of something larger than personal comfort or family approval. The journey from that shocking Thanksgiving speech to this moment of clarity had been difficult and painful, but it had also been transformative in ways that made me proud of the choices I had made and excited about the work still ahead. 5 years after that pivotal Thanksgiving dinner, I stood in the auditorium of Harvard Medical School addressing a packed audience of medical students, philanthropists, and international healthcare leaders. The occasion was the announcement of a revolutionary new partnership between the Sofia Castillo Foundation and the World Health Organization, a collaboration that would establish pediatric surgical centers in 25 developing countries over the next decade. The girl sitting in the front row caught my attention immediately. She was about 19 years old, with dark hair and intelligent eyes that reminded me of myself at that age. During the question and answer session, she raised her hand and introduced herself as Maria Elena Gutierrez, a first-year medical student from El Salvador who had received one of our foundation scholarships. Dr. Castillo, she said in clear, confident English, I want to thank you for making my education possible, but I also want to ask you something personal. How do you handle the criticism from people who say that international charity work is just a way for wealthy Americans to feel good about themselves while avoiding problems in their own communities? The question was sophisticated and challenging, exactly the kind of critical thinking I hoped to see from scholarship recipients. But it also touched on something I had been grappling with as the Foundation's work expanded and attracted both praise and skepticism from various quarters. That's an excellent question, Maria Elena, I replied, taking a moment to consider my response carefully. And it's one that every philanthropist should ask themselves regularly. The truth is, some international charity work is indeed motivated more by the donor's emotional needs than by genuine understanding of what communities actually require. I explained how the Foundation had evolved its approach over the years, moving away from simply funding equipment purchases to developing comprehensive partnerships with local medical schools and hospitals. Instead of imposing American solutions on foreign problems, we now worked exclusively with healthcare leaders in each country to identify their most pressing needs and design programs that would be sustainable long after our initial funding ended. For example, I continued, when we first started working in Guatemala, I thought the biggest need was newer surgical equipment. But Dr. Santos taught me that the real challenge was training local surgeons who could use that equipment effectively and maintain it properly. So we shifted our focus to education and mentorship programs that build long-term capacity rather than creating dependency on external support. After my presentation, Maria Elena approached me with a proposal that would change the direction of my work in ways I never could have anticipated. She had been researching healthcare disparities in rural El Salvador and had identified a network of community health workers who were providing basic medical care but lacked training in surgical assistance and postoperative care. These women already have the trust of their communities, she explained, showing me photos and data she had compiled during summer breaks from medical school. They understand local customs and speak indigenous languages that many doctors don't know. But with additional training, they could dramatically improve surgical outcomes and help more children access the care they need. Her research was impressive and thorough, demonstrating exactly the kind of innovative thinking that could multiply the impact of traditional medical interventions. More importantly, it reflected a deep understanding of how healthcare systems actually function in developing countries, knowledge that could only come from someone who had grown up in those communities. I invited Maria Elena to spend the following summer working with the Foundation, developing a pilot program that would train community health workers in surgical support and recovery care. Her energy and insights reminded me of why I had been drawn to medicine in the first place, the excitement of solving complex problems and the satisfaction of seeing theoretical knowledge translated into practical help for real people. The program she designed became one of our most successful initiatives, training over 300 community health workers across 7 countries and improving surgical outcomes for thousands of children. But more importantly, it established a new model for international healthcare development, one that prioritized local leadership and community knowledge over external expertise. Maria Elena's success also inspired me to expand the Foundation's scholarship program, providing funding not just for medical school tuition but for research projects that addressed healthcare challenges in scholarship recipients' home countries. Within 3 years, we were supporting 47 students from 16 different countries, each working on innovative solutions to problems they understood intimately. The scholarship program created an unexpected but wonderful connection to my own family history. During a Foundation board meeting, I realized that I was now supporting young people's medical education in much the same way that my grandmother had supported mine, providing resources that enabled talented individuals to pursue careers focused on helping others. The parallel was not lost on other board members, including Dr. James Morrison, the former chief of surgery at Boston Children's Hospital who had become one of the Foundation's most devoted advocates. Isabella would be amazed to see how her investment in your education has multiplied, he observed during a break in our quarterly review meeting. She funded one doctor's training, and that doctor is now funding dozens of others. It's the kind of exponential impact that she always believed was possible when resources were used thoughtfully. This observation led to an important realization about the true nature of inheritance and legacy. My grandmother had not just left me money, she had entrusted me with the responsibility of continuing a pattern of investment in human potential. The financial resources were simply tools for accomplishing something much more significant, the creation of opportunities for people to develop their talents and use them for the benefit of others. This understanding shaped my approach to personal relationships as well. I had always been somewhat intimidated by the idea of marriage and family, partly because my medical career demanded so much time and energy, but also because I worried about finding someone who would understand and support the kind of work that gave my life meaning. The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. David Chen was a pediatric cardiologist who had been working with one of our partner hospitals in Ecuador when we first met during a Foundation site visit. He was brilliant and dedicated, fluent in Spanish, and completely committed to providing excellent medical care regardless of patients' ability to pay. Our initial interactions were purely professional, collaborating on complex surgical cases and discussing improvements to the cardiac surgery program we were funding. But over months of working together, I began to appreciate not just his medical expertise but his genuine respect for the communities we were serving and his thoughtful approach to cross-cultural healthcare delivery. The relationship developed slowly and naturally, without the pressure and expectations that had complicated my previous romantic experiences. David understood the demands of medical practice because he shared them, and he supported the Foundation's work because he was participating in it directly. When he proposed during a quiet moment between surgeries at the Ecuador hospital, surrounded by the sounds of children recovering from procedures that had given them new chances at healthy lives, it felt like a natural extension of the partnership we had already built. Our wedding was small and intentional, held in the garden of the family estate with 40 guests who represented the communities and relationships that actually mattered to us. Maria Elena flew in from El Salvador to serve as one of my bridesmaids, along with Dr. Santos from Guatemala and several other colleagues whose friendship had grown out of shared commitment to meaningful work. Brenda served as my maid of honor, a role that symbolized how completely our relationship had healed and evolved. She had become one of the Foundation's most effective board members, using her real estate expertise to develop affordable housing projects near our partner hospitals and creating sustainable funding streams for ongoing operations. The reconciliation with my family had extended beyond just Brenda to include most of the relatives who had initially challenged grandmother's will. Uncle Carlos now managed the Foundation's investment portfolio, ensuring that our endowment would continue growing to support expanding programs. Cousin Elena had established her own nonprofit organization focused on educational opportunities for children from low-income families. But the most significant family development was the birth of my daughter, Isabella Sofia Castillo, 2 years after David and I were married. Holding her for the first time, I understood in a completely new way what my grandmother had meant about the importance of building something that would last beyond your own lifetime. Isabella was born into a world where her name carried the legacy of her great-great-grandmother's values and vision, but also the responsibility of continuing work that would benefit people she might never meet. From her earliest days, she was surrounded by conversations about healthcare equity, international development, and the ways that privilege could be used to create opportunities for others. When she was 6 months old, I took her with me on a Foundation site visit to Colombia, where she charmed doctors and patients alike while I reviewed the progress of a new pediatric surgery training program. The trip reinforced my conviction that meaningful work and family life were not competing priorities but complementary aspects of a well-lived life. The foundation's success had also created opportunities to address healthcare challenges closer to home. We established scholarship programs for students from low-income families in Boston, providing not just tuition support but mentorship and research opportunities that prepared them for careers in medicine and public health. One of these scholarship recipients was Marcus Johnson, a brilliant young man from Roxbury who had been interested in medicine since childhood but whose family had never imagined that medical school was financially possible. His academic record was outstanding, but more importantly, he had spent years volunteering at community health centers and understood the barriers that prevented many families from accessing quality healthcare. Marcus's research project focused on developing mobile medical units that could provide pediatric care in underserved neighborhoods throughout Massachusetts. His work demonstrated that with relatively modest investment, it was possible to dramatically improve health outcomes for children whose families faced transportation challenges or lacked insurance coverage. The mobile clinic program became another foundation success story, but it also represented something more personal for me. Supporting Marcus's education and research felt like honoring the memory of my own grandmother, who had always believed that investing in young people's potential was the most effective form of philanthropy. These domestic programs also helped address the criticism that had been raised by Maria Elena during my Harvard presentation. Instead of focusing exclusively on international work, we were now supporting healthcare improvements in our own community, while maintaining our commitment to global pediatric surgery development. The balance between local and international programs reflected lessons I had learned about the complexity of humanitarian work and the importance of understanding that poverty and healthcare challenges exist everywhere, not just in developing countries. By the time Isabella reached her third birthday, the foundation had grown into one of the most respected pediatric healthcare organizations in the world. We had funded surgical procedures for over 8,000 children, provided scholarships for 230 medical students, and established sustainable healthcare programs in 37 countries. But the statistics, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real measure of success was in the individual lives that had been changed and the communities that had been strengthened by access to quality medical care. I thought about this impact during Isabella's birthday party, held in the same garden where my grandmother had once grown her prize-winning roses. The guests included families from all the communities where our work had made a difference, children who had benefited from foundation-funded surgeries, medical students who were pursuing careers in pediatric surgery because of scholarship support. Watching my daughter play with children from Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, and dozens of other countries, I realized that she was growing up in a world that embodied my grandmother's vision of how wealth could be used to build bridges between communities and create opportunities for human flourishing. The party also included family members who had initially opposed my inheritance but had come to appreciate the work it had made possible. Uncle Raphael's granddaughter was now applying for one of our medical scholarships, hoping to specialize in pediatric cardiology. Cousin Elena's son was volunteering with our mobile clinic program, learning about healthcare disparities in his own community. These developments represented something more significant than just family reconciliation. They showed how values and priorities could be transmitted across generations, creating legacy that extended far beyond financial inheritance. As the afternoon celebration wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, Brenda approached me with a special gift for Isabella. It was a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to our grandmother, decorated with intricate carvings and lined with soft velvet. I found this in grandmother's bedroom when we were cleaning out her things, Brenda explained, opening the box to reveal a collection of small mementos and keepsakes. There are photos of all the grandchildren, ticket stubs from medical conferences you spoke at, and letters from some of the families you've helped through the foundation. Inside the box was also a handwritten note from grandmother, dated just a few weeks before her death. It was addressed to her future great-granddaughter, whoever she might be, and it contained advice about using privilege responsibly and finding meaningful work that would make the world better for others. I hope you will grow up understanding that wealth is not about what you can buy for yourself, the note read in grandmother's careful handwriting, but about what you can make possible for people who need help and hope. Your great-great-grandmother chose to trust your mother with resources that represented generations of family work, and your mother has used them to save lives and create opportunities that honor our family's best values. Reading those words, I felt the profound satisfaction that comes from knowing you have lived up to someone's trust and expectations. My grandmother had seen something in me that I hadn't fully understood about myself, a capacity for using privilege in service of something larger than personal comfort or social status. But more importantly, she had given me the opportunity to discover that the most fulfilling life was one dedicated to helping others achieve their potential and overcome challenges that might otherwise seem insurmountable. As I tucked Isabella into bed that night, I thought about the future I wanted to help create for her and for all the children whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. It was a future where healthcare was accessible to everyone regardless of their economic circumstances, where talented young people could pursue medical careers without financial barriers, and where wealth was understood as a tool for community building rather than personal aggrandizement. The broken phone from that Thanksgiving dinner had been replaced by countless connections to people around the world who shared a commitment to making healthcare more equitable and effective. The family relationships that had seemed so damaged by inheritance disputes had been rebuilt around shared values and collaborative work. Most importantly, the legacy that my grandmother had entrusted to me was now being carried forward by a new generation of doctors, researchers, and community health workers who understood that their skills and knowledge were gifts to be shared with people who needed them most. Standing in the nursery where my daughter slept peacefully, surrounded by photos from Foundation projects and letters from families we had helped, I understood that this was what true success looked like. It was measured not in dollars accumulated or possessions acquired, but in lives saved, opportunities created, and hope restored for people who had thought their circumstances were unchangeable. The journey from that shocking Thanksgiving speech to this moment of deep fulfillment had taught me that the most important inheritance we can leave for future generations is not financial wealth, but the example of how to use whatever advantages we have been given to make the world more just and compassionate for everyone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.